Hey there, welcome to Mr. Cozy Bedtime True Crime Stories. Tonight, we're diving into 2 hours of gripping true crime cases. Real stories of mystery, betrayal, and cold-blooded crimes, all set against the soothing backdrop of rain. It's the perfect blend of calm and unsettling. If these cases draw you in, tap that like button, share with your fellow true crime lovers, and subscribe to join our curious community. I'm always wondering, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. Now settle in, and let's dig into the darkness. Story 1. Christmas Day is the one morning of the year when even the most ordinary street corner feels dressed for something larger than itself. Decorations hang from storefronts. The air has a particular stillness, a gentle and collective suspension, as though the whole world has taken a breath and agreed, just for this one day, to pause. The parking lot of a Walgreens on Northwest 13th Street in Gainesville, Florida, would have had that quality too on December 25th, 2023. A few cars parked at careful angles. The sound of the highway at a distance. Holiday music drifting from somewhere inside the store. It was 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and a court-ordered child custody exchange was about to take place. Within minutes, a woman was dead, a man was bleeding, 5 children were screaming in a car, and Amanda Jansen was driving away at high speed. The Christmas afternoon that had been so ordinary just moments before would never be ordinary again for anyone who witnessed it. To understand what happened in that parking lot, it is necessary to understand the world that Amanda Jansen had been living in for the 2 years preceding it. She was 38 years old in December 2023, a resident of Alachua, a small city in Alachua County, Florida, not far from Gainesville. She had 5 children, ranging from a teenager down to an infant of 11 months. Her life, to any outside observer, was structured entirely around those children. The logistics of their care, their school days, their meals, their needs. She was, in the most tangible and demanding sense of the word, a mother, and motherhood had become the organizing principle of her existence. In September 2021, Amanda had begun a relationship with a man named Thomas Williams. She was not a young woman discovering love for the first time. She was a woman in her mid-30s, already a mother to 4 children, who had found in Thomas a connection she believed was meaningful. Within a year of their relationship beginning, Amanda gave birth to their daughter together, an infant girl who was 11 months old by Christmas of 2023. For Amanda, this child was not simply a baby. She was a final, precious bond, the physical evidence of a love that had felt real and had produced something irreplaceable. What Amanda would eventually come to believe, or perhaps what she came to know, was that the love had not been what she thought it was. During the relationship, Thomas had maintained a close connection with another woman, a 31-year-old named Anna Haslop Terrell. Anna was married. Thomas and Anna had, according to Amanda's understanding of the situation, been involved with each other in ways that extended beyond friendship, and the emotional betrayal that Amanda felt when she arrived at this conclusion was not quiet or contained. It was the kind of betrayal that reshaped the entire architecture of her inner world. Amanda made a decision that escalated every tension around her. She contacted Anna Haslop Terrell's husband and told him about what she believed was happening between his wife and Thomas. The revelation fractured Anna's marriage and sent shockwaves through the interconnected lives of all 4 adults. Whatever relief or righteousness Amanda may have felt in that disclosure, the practical consequences were immediate and severe. Within weeks of the disclosure, Thomas Williams filed paperwork in Putnam County for custody of their 11-month-old daughter. The child, who was supposed to be Amanda's anchor, had become a legal battlefield. On December 20th, 2023, 5 days before Christmas, a Florida court issued its ruling. The judge had reviewed the circumstances and arrived at what family law courts typically pursue as the safest available arrangement: 50-50 custody, shared between both parents. The order was handed down, and it had the weight of legal finality. The parents were directed to arrange a transfer of the baby. They settled on Christmas Day. They settled on the Walgreens at 3909 Northwest 13th Street in Gainesville at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. For most people in a difficult co-parenting arrangement, a supervised custody exchange at a public location is understood to be a neutral, safe choice, a place where visibility and the presence of bystanders provides a natural check on tension. Amanda had agreed to it. She had noted the time and the place. But what she was doing in the days and hours before that exchange told a story that the agreement itself did not. On Christmas morning, Amanda Jansen loaded her 5 children into her car and drove from her home in Alachua toward Gainesville. She had all 5 of them with her, the oldest a teenager, the youngest the infant daughter she was legally required to hand over to Thomas at 2 o'clock. The drive from Alachua to Gainesville takes roughly 30 minutes along the highway, a stretch of Florida road lined with pine trees and the occasional gas station, flat and direct, the kind of drive that offers a person plenty of time to think. On the way, Amanda made a stop. She pulled into a store near the Walgreens and turned to her oldest son. She gave him her debit card and her food stamp card. She told him to use them to pay his cell phone bill. She explained calmly and specifically how to do it. Her son accepted the cards and the instructions. His mother had never done this before. She had never handed him those cards, never given him those instructions, never left him with that particular kind of responsibility on any prior occasion. The significance of that moment was not immediately apparent to her son. He was a teenager on Christmas morning, receiving an unusual set of instructions from his mother, and the strangeness of it likely registered as exactly that, strange, without the full weight of what it implied. Those cards passed from a mother to her teenage son were the clearest evidence of premeditation the case produced. She was not going to the parking lot to hand over a baby and drive home. She was preparing for what came after. At 2 o'clock on Christmas afternoon, Thomas Williams arrived at the Walgreens on Northwest 13th Street. He was not alone. Anna Haslop Terrell, the woman whose relationship with Thomas had set the entire unraveling in motion, was with him. The parking lot was quiet in the way that commercial spaces are on major holidays. The store open but the traffic thin, the handful of cars belonging to shoppers and staff, the afternoon light falling pale and unhurried across the asphalt. Amanda pulled in with her 5 children. Witnesses in the parking lot had taken note of the vehicles, of the custody exchange that was evidently being arranged, the movement of adults and the sounds of children. Amanda got out of her car. She walked toward the vehicle where Thomas and Anna were seated. She had a handgun. She raised it and fired. She fired 6 shots in total, 3 into Anna Haslop Terrell and 3 into Thomas Williams, firing at both of them with a controlled precision that spoke not of panic but of purpose. The shots rang out in the holiday quiet of the parking lot, and the people who heard them described the sound in that particular way that witnesses always describe gunfire in places where gunfire has no business being. First a confusion, a misidentification, and then the terrible certainty. One witness, near the entrance to the store, heard what sounded like a pop and turned to see people running. Another customer described hearing pop, pop, pop in rapid succession. A teenage boy's voice, believed by investigators to be Amanda's oldest son, was heard in the chaos, begging her to stop. The sound of a child begging his mother not to shoot is not a sound that the witnesses who heard it are likely to forget, regardless of how many Christmases come after this one. Anna Haslop Terrell, 31 years old, collapsed near the vehicle. Paramedics arrived and performed CPR on her for nearly 10 minutes in the parking lot of that Walgreens while the Christmas afternoon continued around them, as though the world itself could not process what was happening quickly enough to stop. After 10 minutes of effort, the paramedics made the determination that nothing more could be done. Anna was pronounced dead at the scene. Thomas Williams, struck 3 times, was critically wounded. He was rushed to a hospital. He survived. Before the day was over, he would speak to detectives from his hospital bed, telling them that Amanda had shot Anna at point-blank range before turning the gun on him, and that the context was the obsession she had developed around the text messages she claimed to have found between him and Anna. Amanda Jansen did not wait to see whether Anna survived. She did not surrender. She did not drop the weapon and wait for the police, who were already being called by the witnesses running from the parking lot. She got back into her car, where her children were waiting, and she drove. The Gainesville Police Department received the call and dispatched units to the Walgreens parking lot, and almost simultaneously received reports of a vehicle fleeing the scene at speed. Dashcam and bodycam footage captured what followed. A chase across Gainesville that covered 13 miles of city streets and suburban roads. Amanda's small Kia weaving through intersections and traffic as police vehicles attempted to close in. At some point during the chase, her vehicle struck another car. She did not stop. Inside her car, her 5 children were present for every mile of it. The infant, who was supposed to have been handed over to Thomas at 2 o'clock, was still buckled into her seat. The teenager who had accepted his mother's debit card and instructions an hour before was now watching her drive at speed with law enforcement in pursuit. Whatever the children understood or did not understand in those 13 miles, the experience was one that no child, at any age, should be placed inside. The chase ended. Officers brought the vehicle to a stop and approached with their weapons drawn. The bodycam footage shows Amanda emerging from the car, her voice audible, telling the officers that she needed to get her children home. The officers secured her. A handgun was found beside her vehicle on the ground. When they searched her pockets, they found 2 fully loaded magazines. She had brought ammunition for more shots than she had fired. The children were separated from Amanda and placed in the care of approved relatives through the child welfare system. The infant, whose first Christmas was this day, was taken somewhere safe. Each of the 5 children, from the teenager who had begged his mother to stop to the baby who had no language yet for any of it, was now in a world that had changed irrevocably in the 30 minutes between a custody exchange and a parking lot and a 13-mile chase through the streets of Gainesville, Florida. Amanda Jansen was arrested and transported to the Alachua County Jail. The initial charges reflected the gravity of what the evidence already showed. First-degree homicide for the death of Anna Haslop Terrell, attempted first-degree homicide for the shooting of Thomas Williams, 5 counts of child neglect without great bodily harm for exposing each of her children to the violence and the subsequent chase, and a charge of fleeing law enforcement. The investigation that followed was, in certain respects, unusually complete. The parking lot of a commercial pharmacy on a major holiday is not a place without cameras or witnesses. Security footage from the Walgreens itself captured the shooting with the impersonal, unblinking precision that surveillance cameras bring to their work. Multiple witnesses had been present and had spoken immediately to responding officers. Thomas Williams had survived and was able to give a full account. And the body cam recordings from the officers who pursued Amanda and took her into custody provided a visual record of her behavior in the immediate aftermath of the shooting. But beyond the physical evidence, the investigation also recovered the meaning behind the act. Investigators examined Amanda's actions in the hours before the shooting and found the stop at the nearby store, the cards passed to her teenager, the instructions he had never received before. The Gainesville Police Department's arrest report detailed the history, the relationship that had begun in September 2021, the discovery of the alleged affair, Amanda's disclosure to Anna's husband, the retaliatory custody filing, the court order handed down 5 days before Christmas, and the negotiated exchange at a public pharmacy on Christmas Day. Each event in that sequence had ratcheted the tension incrementally higher, and each could be traced in the paper record that a modern life inevitably produces. Text messages, court filings, police reports, phone records. The prosecution had, in the material they assembled, not merely a case of sudden violence in a parking lot, but the documented history of a woman who had watched her relationship dissolve, felt betrayed by the man who had fathered her youngest child, perceived Anna Haslop Terrell as the instrument of that betrayal, and had arrived at a point where the court order that gave Thomas partial custody of their infant had become the final unbearable provocation. Officers who worked the case described it, in the language of people who have seen many things in their careers, as one of the worst they had ever encountered. not solely because of the violence, which was severe enough, but because of the context. Christmas Day, 5 children present, a public parking lot, and a woman who had apparently made a decision that she was not going home without having done what she came to do. In the legal proceedings that followed, Amanda Jansen took a path that spared the families, the witnesses, and the court the full ordeal of a trial. She entered a plea of no contest to all 8 counts. Second-degree murder as a lesser-included charge negotiated from the original first-degree charge. Attempted first-degree murder for the shooting of Thomas Williams, the charge of fleeing law enforcement, and 5 individual counts of child neglect. A plea of no contest is not an admission of guilt in the conventional sense, but under Florida law, the court treats it as the functional equivalent, and Judge Denise R. Ferrero adjudicated her guilty on all 8 counts. The sentencing hearing produced a sentence that was both precise in its details and absolute in its consequence. Judge Ferrero sentenced Amanda to life in prison for the murder of Anna Haslop Terrell, carrying with it a mandatory minimum of 25 years. She added 30 years for the attempted first-degree murder of Thomas Williams. She added 15 years for fleeing law enforcement. She added 5 years on each of the 5 child neglect counts. The sentences were structured to run consecutively, meaning one after another, not simultaneously, so that the additional years would follow the life sentence. In practical terms, Amanda Jansen would never leave prison. The judge also issued provisions that carried their own particular weight. No contact with Anna Haslop Terrell's family, and no contact with Amanda's own children until a licensed therapist recommended it and a court entered a specific order to that effect. The 5 children Amanda had driven to a parking lot on Christmas morning, the 5 children who had been present for every shot fired and every mile of the chase, would not see or hear from their mother again until a professional and a judge determined that it was safe for them to do so. The firearm was ordered forfeited by the court. Anna Haslop Terrell was 31 years old when she died in the parking lot of a Florida Walgreens on Christmas Day. She was not a character in someone else's conflict. She was a person with her own life, her own relationships, her own story, her own morning routines, and private worries and plans for the future she had not yet lived. Whatever the details of her personal life, whatever the circumstances of her connection to Thomas Williams, she was not the one who had produced the court order, or the custody arrangement, or the firearms, or the decision to use them. She had been present that afternoon, and her presence had cost her everything. For Thomas Williams, who survived, the bullet wounds would eventually heal in the way that physical wounds do. What would not heal so cleanly was the knowledge of what had happened in that parking lot while he watched. The shots, the woman beside him, the chaos, and the 5 children in the car across the asphalt, one of them his own daughter, witnessing what was being done in the name of a dispute over her custody. The children of Amanda Jansen carry the weight of that Christmas afternoon in ways that cannot be fully assessed from the outside. The teenager who accepted the debit card and the instructions and later begged his mother to stop. The younger siblings who were there in the car, but too small to understand the language of what was happening. The infant who will grow up knowing her first Christmas from records rather than memory. Each of them, placed with relatives after the arrest, entered a new world on the day their mother was taken away in handcuffs. The case of Amanda Jansen sits in the territory where betrayal, custody law, jealousy, and violence converge, a territory that the legal system encounters with depressing regularity, but that never loses its capacity to shock when it manifests in a public space on a holiday afternoon. It asks difficult questions about the distance between what a person feels and what a person does, and about who bears the price when that distance collapses entirely. Amanda Jansen is now serving life in a Florida women's prison. The Christmas parking lot has returned to its ordinary function. The security cameras continue their unblinking work. And somewhere in Alachua County, 5 children are being raised by relatives, growing up in the shadow of a December afternoon that their mother engineered, and that no one who witnessed it will ever fully leave behind. Story 2. There are moments in a life that seem, on the surface, to contain only ordinary things. A new ring on a finger. The early, private news of a pregnancy. A relationship that has been difficult but feels, in its most recent chapter, as though it is finally finding its footing. These were the small, precious details that define the world of Leila Duarte Daluz in the winter of 2022. She was 34 years old. She had a new engagement ring. She was 2 months pregnant. And on the morning of December 21st, 2022, she got into a car in the dark, hours before sunrise, because the man who was supposed to love her had asked her to come. She was never seen alive again. Leila's story begins far from the cold ponds and pine-lined highways of Rhode Island. She was born in Cape Verde, an archipelago of islands off the western coast of Africa that is known for its music, its ocean winds, and the particular quality of resilience that its people carry into the world when they leave. Cape Verde has sent its children to America for generations, and those children, when they settle in the communities of southeastern Massachusetts and Rhode Island, carry with them a pride in their roots that remains vivid even after years away from the islands. Leila was one of those children. She had built her life in Brockton, Massachusetts, a city with deep Cape Verdean roots, and she had done so with the energy of a woman who believed in what could be made through determination and education. She was described by those who loved her as educated, ambitious, and full of dreams. She had the kind of presence that people notice and remember, warmth that was genuine, and a mind that was sharp. It was in the landscape of her adult life in Brockton that she met Gary Gromkiewicz, a Rhode Island man in his mid-30s who moved through her social world and eventually into her personal one. The relationship was not simple or uncomplicated. Gary had a girlfriend of roughly 6 years, a woman named Miranda, and it was during a brief break in that relationship in the autumn of 2022 that he and Leila had become involved. By December of that year, the involvement had produced something irreversible. Leila was 8 to 10 weeks pregnant with Gary's child. She wore the new engagement ring like a promise. Whether Gary had given it to her, or whether its presence represented her own hope for what the relationship might become, the ring was there, visible on her hand, on the morning that she stepped outside her Brockton home and into the dark. It was approximately 2:30 in the morning on December 21st, 2022, the early hours of one of the shortest, coldest days of the year in New England, when Gary Gromkiewicz and his companion Michael Lambert arrived at Leila's home. They had made the drive from Rhode Island to Brockton in the middle of the night, a journey of roughly an hour in the emptied highway hours before dawn. Leila came outside and got into the vehicle. She knew Gary. She trusted him, or trusted him enough to get in. Whether she felt the particular quality of wrongness that sometimes arrives in the body before the mind has processed it, no one can say. What is known is that she got in, and that the car turned around and headed back toward Rhode Island. Michael Lambert was with Gary that night, and the history that Lambert carried with him into that vehicle was one that Leila likely did not know. In 1994, when Michael was just 17 years old, he and another man had beaten and stabbed a homeless man to death on Thanksgiving Day beneath an Interstate 95 on-ramp in Providence, Rhode Island. He had been convicted of that murder, had served a lengthy prison sentence, and had been released in 2022. He had been a free man for only months when he climbed into Gary's car on that December morning. It was during his time in prison that Gary and Michael had met, two men whose paths had crossed inside the system, a friendship forged in confinement that would now produce its worst consequences outside it. The car moved south and east through the darkness of the New England winter, crossing the state line from Massachusetts into Rhode Island. Cell phone data and surveillance footage would later allow investigators to reconstruct the route with unsettling precision, like a map drawn over a nightmare. The three of them traveled through the night, the car making multiple stops in Rhode Island, through the Buttonwood section of Warwick and past a gas station and convenience store in Lincoln, stopping and starting in a pattern that suggested something other than any innocent destination. At approximately 6:18 in the morning, the car's movement placed it in western Coventry, Rhode Island, in the area surrounding a body of water called Carbuncle Pond. The name belongs to a gem, a deep red stone that has been associated with both beauty and fire. The pond in Coventry does not share those qualities. In December, it is a still, icy body of water surrounded by frozen shoreline and winter-stripped trees, a place where fishermen come in warmer months and where, in the small and quiet hours of a December morning, no one would be watching. At around 7 in the morning on December 22nd, 2022, a fisherman arrived at Carbuncle Pond. What he found in the water stopped him completely. Beneath the surface, through the ice that had formed at the pond's edge, he could see the shape of a human body. He called authorities immediately. Emergency responders from Coventry and the Rhode Island State Police arrived at the pond's edge and retrieved the body of a woman from the water. She was face down. She had multiple lacerations on her head. She was not breathing. She had no identification on her, and in the first hours she was simply an unknown woman, pulled from a pond, in the early morning of a winter Thursday. The Rhode Island State Police began the forensic and investigative work that would ultimately tell the full story of how she came to be there. The medical examiner was called, and what the examination revealed was a picture of what Layla Deluz had endured in her final hours that was both methodical and devastating. Dr. Alexander Cherkov, the medical examiner, identified 6 separate lacerations on her head, blunt force wounds consistent with repeated, deliberate impacts. But the finding that carried the heaviest weight was not the lacerations. It was the water in her lungs, and in her stomach. She had been alive when she entered the water. She had been beaten, and she had been alive, and she had been placed into the frozen water of Carbuncle Pond while her body still drew breath. She had drowned. The medical examiner also determined that Layla had been pregnant 8 to 10 weeks along, a detail that the investigators who received this information carried with them through every day that followed. She had been carrying a life inside her, and both lives had been taken together at the edge of that pond in the dark of a December morning. The investigation began with the unidentified woman and worked outward. Missing persons reports were cross-referenced. The description of the victim was circulated. Through those channels, investigators identified her as Layla Duarte Deluz of Brockton, Massachusetts, and from that identification, the inquiry moved swiftly into the structure of her personal life. The name Gary Gromkiewicz surfaced quickly. He was her fiancé, or the nearest equivalent, the man whose child she had been carrying. Detectives from the Rhode Island State Police began pulling the digital footprint of the night in question. Cell phone location data, the kind of information that towers and service providers record as a matter of routine, became the primary tool through which the story of December 21st began to take shape. Detective Corporal Robert Hopkins testified at trial about what the cell data showed with a precision that made the narrative almost impossible to refute. At 6:36 in the morning, both Michael Lambert's cellular phone and Layla Deluz's cellular phone were connecting to a cell tower in Connecticut, in the approximate area surrounding Carbuncle Pond. The phones placed the three of them together in that location at that time. Then, in another data point that investigators noted carefully, Gary Gromkiewicz's phone showed no communications with the network between 5:05 and 8:14 on the morning of December 21st, a period of more than 3 hours during which his phone was effectively dark. That gap was not accidental. Investigators examining the search history associated with Gary's devices discovered something that the prosecution would later describe as the proverbial moment a plan reveals itself. Someone had searched. If I turn off location services, can my phone be tracked? The question carried its own answer about intent. A person who planned to commit a crime in a specific location and who wanted to erase the evidence of their presence, there would need to know exactly that. And the search had been conducted before the murder. Surveillance cameras added the visual layer to what the cell data had established in coordinates and timestamps. Footage from multiple locations along the route captured Lambert's vehicle moving through Rhode Island's roads in the early morning, the timestamps matching the cell tower data with a consistency that left no geographic gap through which an alternative explanation might credibly pass. Investigators also turned their attention to the question of motive. and what they found there was a story shaped by fear, concealment, and the particular desperation of a man who had been living two lives and who saw in Layla's pregnancy an exposure he could not control. Gary had been with Miranda for roughly 6 years. During a brief break in that relationship in the autumn, he had become involved with Layla. By December, Layla was pregnant and was wearing an engagement ring. Miranda, according to the investigation's reconstruction, did not know about Layla or about the pregnancy. Gary's relationship with Miranda was the life he was determined to protect, and Layla, alive and pregnant and expecting the future she had been promised, had become a threat to everything he was trying to keep hidden. The prosecution's theory was not that Gary had acted alone. It was that Gary, facing a crisis of his own making and lacking both the courage to face it honestly and the capacity to understand the enormity of what he was about to do, had reached out to his old prison acquaintance Michael Lambert. Lambert, a man who had already killed once and who had been free for only months, had agreed to help. The two men had driven together to Brockton at 2:30 in the morning, had collected Layla from her home under some pretext she believed, and had driven her to a place where the darkness and the cold water could do what they intended. Both men were arrested in May 2023, roughly 5 months after Layla's body was discovered. They were formally indicted by a Rhode Island grand jury in September 2023, charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. The charges reflected what investigators had assembled: not a single act of impulsive violence, but a plan, coordinated between two men, executed in the pre-dawn hours of a December morning. In the months before trial, Gary Gromkiewicz mounted the kind of public defense that social media occasionally enables. He posted on Facebook, using the hashtag that declared his supporters were standing with him, and made claims that contradicted the evidence assembling against him. He insisted that Michael Lambert had acted alone, that he had a solid and provable alibi, and that investigators were deliberately ignoring exculpatory evidence. He found an audience among those who knew him, and who found it difficult to reconcile the person they believed they knew with the charges he faced. His alibi, however, depended on a specific witness. He named April Bateman, a close friend and former colleague, as the person who could place him elsewhere on the morning of December 21st. When investigators spoke to April Bateman, and when she later took the stand at trial, her testimony did not support his account. She told the court that Gary had asked her to be a witness for him regarding December 21st, 2022. That request, with its clear implication, became one of the most significant pieces of testimony the jury heard. The trial began in January 2025, more than 2 years after Layla's death, and it unfolded before two separate juries, one assigned to evaluate the evidence against Gary Gromkiewicz, and one assigned to evaluate the evidence against Michael Lambert. Judge Luis M. Matos had made the unusual procedural decision to try both defendants simultaneously, but before separate juries, allowing the court to hear the shared evidence, once while ensuring that each defendant's fate was decided independently by a panel that had not been exposed to evidence admissible only against the other. The trial lasted 10 days. Over those 10 days, the prosecution's lead attorney, Criminal Division Chief Stephen Dambruch, and his colleague Assistant Attorney General John Corrigan constructed the case with the assembled evidence. The cell phone location data, the surveillance footage, the medical examiner's findings, the testimony of April Bateman about the fabricated alibi, the testimony of a friend of Lambert's who described his movements after the murder, and the digital search history that revealed someone had been researching how to evade phone tracking before the crime was committed. The defense teams for both men attempted, in the way that defense counsel must, to introduce doubt into the jury's assessment of the evidence. Lambert's defense had argued during closing statements that the evidence showed Gary had wanted Layla dead, and that Lambert had carried out the act alone, as an expression of his own dark character, rather than as the co-conspirator the prosecution described. Gary's defense had argued that Gary had not been present, that he had been elsewhere, and that his phone being dark during those crucial hours was the result of his own efforts to protect his privacy rather than evidence of deliberate evasion at the scene of a crime. The juries were not persuaded. On January 17, 2025, both juries returned their verdicts, each finding the defendant before them guilty on both counts: first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. The verdicts came quickly, in the manner of juries that have absorbed evidence they found overwhelming. The sentencing took place on March 28, 2025, in Kent County Superior Court before Judge Luis M. Matos. By that morning, the room held the weight of more than 2 years of grief, investigation, legal process, and the long, slow accumulation of everything that had been taken from Layla de Luz and from those who had loved her. The state, through its prosecutors, argued for no mercy. They told the court that there was no hope for rehabilitation in either man, that the only function the sentencing could serve was punishment and the protection of society. Judge Matos sentenced both Michael Lambert and Gary Gronkiewicz to life in prison, plus an additional 10 years. For Lambert, it was the second time a Rhode Island court had sentenced him for murder. He had killed at 17 and been released, and within months of that release had participated in the killing of a pregnant woman in the darkness beside a frozen pond. For Gary, a man who had constructed a public identity in the months before trial as someone wrongly accused, the sentence represented the full weight of what the juries and the court had concluded: that he had planned the death of the woman who was carrying his child, had enlisted a man with a history of violence to carry it out, and had then attempted to falsify an alibi through a friend who ultimately refused to lie. The Cape Verdean community in Massachusetts and Rhode Island did not simply mourn Layla de Luz in private. Her murder had reached beyond the borders of one family's grief to become a wound felt collectively, particularly among those who had come from the same islands, who had built their lives in the same cities, and who saw in Layla's story the fragility of everything they were working to build. She was one of their own, educated, aspirational, a young woman who had carried Cape Verde with her to America and had tried to make something beautiful from it. The trial had been followed closely, and when the verdicts came in on that January morning, the response from the community was one of exhausted, sorrowful relief. Layla de Luz had been 34 years old. She had been pregnant. She had been wearing an engagement ring. She had stepped outside her front door at 2:30 in the morning because the man she trusted had come to collect her, and she had driven across a state line into a night that never gave her back. She had done nothing wrong. She had wanted nothing more than the ordinary future that her pregnancy represented: a child, a partner, a continuation of the life she had been building since she left Cape Verde and came to a new country with her hopes intact. Carbuncle Pond returned to its winter silence after the body was recovered. The fisherman who had found her went home. The ice eventually melted and came back with the seasons. But the name of the pond, once merely geographical, now carried something else: the memory of a morning when two men arrived at its edge and did what they had come to do, and left, and thought they were finished with her. The cell phone towers remembered the route. The surveillance cameras had been watching. The ice had preserved the evidence of what she had endured. And in the end, 2 juries and a judge made plain that the world had not, in fact, been finished with the truth. She had aspirations and hopes. They were not diminished by the way her life ended. They were simply and permanently interrupted, and they are carried now by everyone who speaks her name. Story 3. There is a particular quality to the light in the San Bernardino Mountains in mid-November. The sky turns a bruised shade of amber and gold as the sun descends behind the ridgeline, and the roads that wind through the pine-covered hills grow narrow and shadowed, swallowed by the kind of silence that only high elevation and isolation can produce. On the morning of November 18, 2025, somewhere along the stretch of Highway 138, near the small mountain community of Crestline, California, a body was discovered at the bottom of a steep embankment, 75 feet below the road's edge. The rocks had been cold all night. No one had known she was there. The woman lying at the base of that cliff had not always been still. She had been, by every account of every person who loved her, one of the most vivid, forward-moving human beings in any room she entered. Her name was Arian Papali, and she was 58 years old, and she had spent her entire adult life building things. A business, a family, a self, and in the last hopeful chapter of her story, a life entirely her own. That last chapter, the one she had been most excited to write, had barely begun before it was taken from her. Arian was born in Iran and grew up in a world shaped by ambition and change. At 18 years old, she made the journey that would define the arc of everything that followed. She came to the United States, bringing with her the kind of tenacity that belongs to people who have had to reach for their lives rather than simply inherit them. California absorbed her, as it has absorbed so many dreamers who arrived with little more than their own determination and an unflinching belief that reinvention was possible. She earned a degree in business and coaching. She built a corporate career with the disciplined precision of someone who understood that the working world rewards those who show up completely. She served as the chief financial officer and vice president of operations in her professional life, roles that spoke not just to ambition but to a rigorous, ordered intelligence. She was a woman who understood money, strategy, and the mechanics of making things work. It was in California that she met Gordon Abbas Gaddarzi, a man who matched her energy in the early years and seemed to share her vision of what a life well-built might look like. Gordon was an engineer and entrepreneur, the kind of man who spoke the language of innovation fluently and moved through the business world with confidence. Their partnership began in romance and extended into commerce. Together, Arian and Gordon co-founded US Hybrid, a clean energy company positioned in the growing landscape of sustainable technology. They were, on paper and in practice, a formidable team. They bought a 5-bedroom home in Rolling Hills, one of the most exclusive communities in Los Angeles County, in 2017. They raised 2 sons, Naveed and Milad. For nearly 3 decades, the life they had built together looked, from the outside, like the fulfillment of a promise. But marriages are not built on their exteriors. What a family presents to the world is rarely the full story of what it contains. And what Arian's marriage contained in its later years had grown painful enough that by June 2025, she made a decision that required not just legal paperwork, but a particular kind of courage. She filed for divorce from Gordon Abbas Gaddarzi, citing irreconcilable differences after 28 years of marriage. The divorce proceedings revealed that the couple shared approximately $4.5 million in marital assets, a sum that represented the accumulated value of everything they had built and owned together. That number, it would later emerge, was not insignificant to what happened next. With the divorce filed and her future finally oriented towards something that felt like freedom, Arian Papley did something that told you everything about who she was. She moved to Newport Beach. She did not sit still in her grief or in her legal circumstances. She found a coastal apartment, surrounded herself with art, and began the retirement she had earned and wanted. She volunteered with the South Coast Botanical Garden and with UCLA's Fowler Museum. She took up ceramics. She returned to photography with a renewed eye. In the weeks before her disappearance, she had begun dancing, a detail that carries within it something almost unbearably poignant. A woman of 58 years, who had spent her life in boardrooms and courtrooms and the corridors of corporate responsibility, finally allowing her body simply to move for the joy of it. Her son Naveed, who was pursuing his master's degree at Harvard during this period, described his mother in the months after her death as someone who was so full of inspiration and optimism at this particular moment in her life. The website her family built in her memory showcases her creative work, paintings and ceramics and photographs, the visible evidence of a woman who was not winding down but igniting. In a tribute posted to the site after her death, her children wrote, "Arian Papley spread light, love and joy wherever she went." They described her as an artist, businesswoman, philanthropist, environmentalist, and inspiration. They wrote that her passion for creative expression was only matched by her care for those she loved. These were not the words of a family writing an obituary for someone who had slipped quietly away. These were the words of children describing a mother they were still expecting to call. November 22nd, 2025. That was the day Arian Papley was officially reported missing. The report was filed with Newport Beach Police, setting in motion the standard protocol for a missing adult. The forms, the inquiry, the notice circulated among connected agencies. What neither the reporting family members nor the Newport Beach officers knew as they filed those documents was that a body had already been found 4 days earlier, 75 miles away in the mountains above San Bernardino. On November 18th, authorities responding to a report of a deceased person in the Crestline area had found a woman's body at the base of a 75-foot embankment near Highway 138 and Crestline Road. The location was remote, the kind of place that most people pass through on their way to somewhere else, a stretch of mountain highway where the guardrails are the only things separating the asphalt from a very long fall. Emergency responders from the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department and Fire Department had retrieved the body from the rocky terrain below the road's edge and transported it to the county coroner's office. The woman had no identification on her. No one who arrived at the scene knew her name. The coroner conducted an examination. The injuries found on the body were consistent with a fall, the kind of blunt force trauma that a 75-foot descent onto rock produces. At first assessment, it appeared the death might be attributed to an accident, perhaps someone who had lost their footing near the road's edge or had a medical episode. But as the coroner examined the body with greater precision, the full picture of her injuries told a story that was not consistent with an accident. The manner of death was ultimately ruled a homicide. Investigators needed to know who she was. They took the most difficult, most public step available to them. They released a composite sketch of the unidentified woman's face, asking the public for help in identifying her. For nearly 2 weeks, Arian Papali lay in the county coroner's facility without her name, while her family filed a missing persons report in a city 100 miles away, and her sons tried to understand where their mother had gone. 2 days before Thanksgiving, Navid Gadarzi received the call that no child ever fully prepares for. The San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department notified him that the unidentified woman found in Crestline was his mother. The missing persons inquiry and the homicide investigation had converged, and at their intersection was Arian Papali, identified at last on December 1st, 2025. Navid later described that moment with a rawness that was impossible to read without feeling it. When she was missing, we were sort of going from this frantic pass, all engines flaring, like how can we find her? He said. When we got the news, it sort of feels like the wind gets knocked out of you. The first day it's a lot of shock. He had not spoken to his mother for weeks before she vanished, absorbed in the demanding coursework of his Harvard master's program. The phone calls he had meant to make, the check-ins postponed for tomorrow, had run out of tomorrows. The investigators who took over the homicide case now had a name, a face, and a starting point. The victim was a 58-year-old woman from Newport Beach, a former businesswoman and artist, who had been in the middle of a divorce proceeding. She had been found dead in a remote mountain area, 100 miles from her coastal home, at the base of a cliff that no one accidentally visits. The question of why she was there at all pressed against every other question that followed. Homicide detectives assigned to the Specialized Investigations Division of the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department began reconstructing the days before Arian's death, reaching into her personal life for the thread that would lead them to whoever had brought her to that embankment. What they found as they pulled on that thread was the divorce. The $4.5 million in shared assets sat at the center of the proceeding, and those assets connected directly to a man who had known Arian longer than almost anyone alive, Gordon Abbas Gadarzi. Gordon was the CEO of Mag Motor Technologies at the time of his wife's disappearance, a man of 66 years who had spent his professional life in the technology sector and who, by any external measure, occupied a position of considerable wealth and influence. He lived in the Rolling Hills estate that he and Arian had purchased together in 2017, the same estate that was now a subject of the divorce proceedings. In December 2025, while the investigation was still in its early stages, Gordon attended Arian's memorial service. He stood among the people who had gathered to grieve a woman they loved, the friends and colleagues and admirers of an artist and philanthropist who had touched their lives, and he said nothing to raise alarm. He was present at a memorial for a woman whose death had already been ruled a homicide, whose case was already being actively investigated. He attended her service while the detectives worked. The investigation took 2 months. 2 months of extensive and persistent investigation. In the language of the official press release, a phrase that carries within it the weight of late nights, forensic analysis, witness interviews, and the careful, methodical construction of a case that would hold in court. Investigators did not speak publicly about the specific details of what they found or how they found it, but what they gathered was enough. More than enough. On January 23, 2026, Sheriff's Department deputies arrived at Gordon Abbas Ghadarzi's residence in Rolling Hills. They made the arrest there, at the home that had once been shared by a husband and wife who had built a company together. Gordon was taken into custody, transported to the Central Detention Center in San Bernardino, and held without bail. 2 days later, on January 25, 2026, the San Bernardino County District Attorney's Office announced the charges: felony murder in the first degree. The criminal complaint did not use gentle language. It alleged that the manner in which the crime was carried out indicated planning, sophistication, or professionalism. It alleged that the crime may have involved great violence and bodily harm. It alleged that the victim had been particularly vulnerable. And in an amended complaint that emerged shortly after the initial charges, prosecutors added 2 specific and devastating allegations: that Gordon Ghadarzi had been lying in wait before killing his estranged wife, and that the murder had been motivated by financial gain. Lying in wait is a legal term with precise meaning in California criminal law. It describes a perpetrator who conceals himself, who waits in a hidden or concealed position, and who then emerges to attack a victim who does not see the threat coming. It is the language of a predator, of someone who uses patience and concealment as weapons, who strips the victim of the only chance they might have had to run. Applied to the death of Arian Papali, it painted a picture that was almost unbearable in its specificity. A woman who had relocated to a coastal city to begin her new life in art and freedom, who had not understood that the dissolution of her marriage had made her not safe but endangered. The allegation of financial motivation connected the dots that the divorce proceeding had drawn. Arian had filed for divorce in June 2025. She had cited irreconcilable differences, the legal language for a marriage that had run its course. The shared assets, the home, the accumulated wealth of 28 years of joint enterprise, all of it was now subject to California's divorce laws. California is a community property state, which means that assets acquired during a marriage are generally divided equally upon divorce. Whatever Arian stood to receive from the dissolution of her marriage was, according to the prosecutor's theory, worth more to Gordon as a motive than as a settlement. Gordon Ghadarzi pleaded not guilty. His arraignment took place in February 2026, and he remained in custody without bail as the legal proceedings began to take shape. The case, still in its early stages as of early 2026, carried the full weight of a prosecution that had taken 2 months to build, and that had charged a 66-year-old technology executive with the premeditated, financially motivated murder of the woman he had been married to for nearly 3 decades. The mountain community of Crestline, which had no particular connection to either Arian Papali or Gordon Ghadarzi, had become the site of an act that prosecutors alleged was planned, professional, and cold. Someone had needed to bring Arian to that remote stretch of Highway 138, 100 miles from her Newport Beach apartment, to a place where no one would look for her, where the geography would do its terrible work, and where the initial impression of a tragic accident might hold long enough to allow the perpetrator to return to ordinary life. It had almost worked. The initial autopsy had noted injuries consistent with a fall. The body had not been immediately identified. The missing persons report had come 4 days after the body was found. The suspect had attended the memorial service. For 2 months, the pieces had sat apart from one another, and only the quiet, determined work of the investigators had drawn them into alignment. What could not be hidden, in the end, was the homicide ruling itself. The coroner's finding that the circumstances of Arian's death were not consistent with accident was the door through which everything else eventually walked. Once the manner of death was declared a homicide, the investigation had both a mandate and a direction. And once detectives learned who Arian Papley was, and who was standing to gain the most from her death, the path narrowed quickly. The family Arian left behind was changed irrevocably by the November morning on which she disappeared. Naveed and Milad, her two sons, had grown up watching a mother and father build something from scratch, a company, a household, a name. Naveed had told the Los Angeles Times in December that seeing his parents work together had taught him that nothing is impossible. He had said this as a tribute to two people he had admired equally. By the time January came, one of those people was in jail, accused of killing the other. The tribute website that Naveed built for his mother, the one he said he wished he could have created while she was still alive to see it, stands today as a record of what the world lost on November 18, 2025. It shows her ceramic work, her photographs, the paintings she had made in the creative retirement she had barely had time to inhabit. It shows the face of a woman in the middle of becoming something new, someone freer, someone who had decided in the second half of her life that she was entitled to joy on her own terms. The case of Arian Papley is, at its surface, a case about a body found at the base of a cliff, about a divorce and a disputed fortune, about an arrest and criminal charges that will take months more of legal proceedings to resolve. But at its center, it is a story about a woman who spent 28 years building a life alongside someone, and who, when she finally tried to reclaim the life that was entirely her own, never made it out of the mountains. The wheels of the law continue to turn. Gordon Abbas Ghadarzi remains in custody. The courtroom that will eventually hold his trial will hear evidence and testimony that stretches back across decades of a marriage and forward into the careful, precise work of the detectives who refused to accept that what happened near Crestline was simply an accident. The verdict, when it comes, will be rendered in a chamber of legal formality, in dry procedural language. But the truth of who Arian Papley was is not held in any courtroom. It is held in the ceramics she shaped with her own hands, in the photographs she took of a world she found beautiful, in the garden she volunteered in the dance studio she had only just begun to visit, in the hearts of two sons who built a website in her honor and called her, with the simple conviction of people who knew her completely, an inspiration. Story 4. There are mornings that arrive with the ordinary grace of any other morning, carrying coffee and birdsong, and the sound of a neighborhood waking up to its familiar rhythms. October 28, 2012, was supposed to be one of those mornings. Derek Dorsey had been working through the night, as he had done hundreds of times before in his career as a Jacksonville firefighter, putting in the long and exhausting hours of a 24-hour shift that demanded his complete attention and physical endurance. By the time he drove home through the streets of his gated community in Jacksonville, Florida, he was tired in the deep, bone-level way of a man who had spent a full rotation giving everything he had to a job that asked for nothing less. All he wanted was to see his wife, to be in his home, and to rest. What he found when he walked through his front door would mark the dividing line of his life between everything that came before it and everything that came after. Kim Dorsey was 38 years old, a woman full of the kind of physical confidence and personal drive that makes people instinctively gravitate toward you. She had a personality that filled rooms, an energy that found its outlet in movement and ambition. She was a fitness enthusiast and personal trainer, the kind of person who believed that the body and its potential were worth taking seriously. She had built her days around the gym, around discipline, around the structure of someone who valued what commitment could produce. She and Derek had built a life together in their comfortable home inside a gated community in Jacksonville, a home with a swimming pool, a neighborhood where neighbors looked out for neighbors, where safety felt like something you could count on. They had known each other through the military and had eventually settled into the civilian world together, navigating the rhythms of his demanding shift work and the texture of a marriage that, like all marriages, contained both its brightness and its private shadows. When Derek pushed open the bedroom door on that October morning, the room he stepped into was not the room he had left the day before. The signs of what had happened were everywhere, overwhelming in their violence and their specificity. A pool cue lay broken on the floor, shattered by the force with which it had been used as a weapon. A gun was there. Bullet holes marked the walls, not one, not two, but 5 separate points where a bullet had entered, testimony to 5 desperate, defiant shots fired by someone fighting for her life. Blood was on the floor. Blood was on the walls. And at the center of it all, lying face down on the carpet in the bedroom, where she had slept safely every night before this one, was Kim. She was not breathing. There was blood at her neck. Her wrists bore the marks of zip ties. She was not covered, not protected, and she was gone. Derek, whose firefighter training gave him the presence of mind to try, when everything inside him must have been collapsing, knelt beside her and performed CPR. He pushed with his hands and breathed and tried. He called 911. And then, after a moment that would stay with him forever, he became aware of something no amount of professional training prepares a person for. His wife's body had already grown cold and stiff. She had been gone for hours before he came home. When detectives from the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office arrived at the Dorsey home, what greeted them was, in the words of the lead investigator who spoke publicly about the case, probably one of the most horrific crime scenes I had ever seen. There was the broken pool cue. There was the knife. There was the gun and the bullet holes, 5 of them, pressed into the walls in a pattern that told a story even before anyone had spoken a word. There were the zip ties. There was the blood. And there was Derek, covered in his wife's blood from the CPR he had performed, visibly destroyed, trying to answer questions while his mind was still barely keeping pace with the reality he had walked into. The first thing the lead detective, identified in later accounts as Detective Kuzowski, noticed even before entering the house was something small and almost dismissible, a decorative dog statue by the front door, knocked onto its side, sitting at the wrong angle. It was the kind of detail that a lesser I might pass over entirely. He noted it and moved on into the chaos of the interior. What that toppled statue meant would not become clear for many weeks. As investigators began to process the scene, the forensic picture that assembled itself was one of almost incomprehensible violence. Kim's autopsy would later establish that she had been killed by 2 causes working in terrible combination: blunt force trauma to the head and a stab wound to the neck. Forensic blood spatter analysis suggested that she had been struck hard in the face early in the attack, likely punched, causing nasal bleeding. She had been restrained, bound at the wrists with zip ties and secured to a piece of furniture, the kind of deliberate, methodical act of restraint that strips a victim of the capacity to fight back. But Kim had fought back anyway. In the drawer beside the bed, she had kept a firearm. Somehow, in the midst of the attack, restrained and brutalized, Kim Dorsey had gotten to that drawer. She had gotten her hand on that gun. And she had fired it 5 separate times at the person who was doing this to her. All 5 shots missed. But 5 shots, fired from the hands of a woman who had been beaten and bound, told investigators something profound about the woman they were trying to understand. She had not surrendered. She had not given up. She had fought with every atom of strength available to her until the very end. The autopsy further revealed that Kim had been subjected to physical violence before her death. The full picture of what she had endured in those last hours was one that the detectives working the case found difficult to process, even in their professional capacity. This had not been a quick death. It had been prolonged, brutal, and terrifying. In the first hours of any homicide investigation, the people closest to the victim must be examined, not out of cruelty, but out of statistical reality. The vast majority of victims are killed by someone known to them. Derek Dorsey, standing blood-covered at the perimeter of his own home, fell into the natural first category of scrutiny. Investigators noted that he had covered Kim's body with a blanket after performing CPR, a gesture of protection and love that was simultaneously a disruption of the crime scene. That act of covering her, that instinctive human impulse to give dignity to someone he loved, was noted in the investigative file. Then, in an interview with detectives, Derek made a disclosure that shifted the atmosphere of the room. He admitted that he had been involved in a romantic relationship outside his marriage. He had been, in the blunt language of one investigator who spoke about the case, living two different lives. The revelation introduced a motive where none had previously existed. A husband with an affair, a wife who might have discovered it, a marriage under private strain. These were elements that experience had taught investigators to take seriously. But Derek had something that could not be challenged or dismissed. 24 hours of verified, documented presence elsewhere. His workplace confirmed his shift. Surveillance cameras at the gated community recorded him leaving that morning. His phone records were consistent with his account. He had been at the fire station the entire night, and the physical evidence could find no thread connecting him to the crime itself. He was removed from the suspect list. Investigators then turned to another person who had recently occupied a significant space in the Dorsey's household. A young man named Joshua, 21 years old, had lived with the couple for several months. Derek had given him a job, taken him in, extended him a form of mentorship. When detectives informed Joshua that Kim was dead, the response they witnessed unsettled them. He did not react the way someone receives news about a distant acquaintance. He took it like you had told him that his mother died, Detective Kuzowski noted. The intensity of that grief opened a line of inquiry. Had Joshua developed a fixation on Kim? Had the closeness of the living arrangement produced something more complicated than gratitude? Investigators examined Joshua's alibi carefully. It held. His whereabouts at the time of Kim's death were verified, and he was cleared. But the investigation had not yet found the person it was looking for, and the days were passing. What broke the case open was not a dramatic confession or a witness who came forward, but rather the patient accumulation of data that tends to define methodical detective work. Investigators pulled every piece of Kim's digital life that they could access. Her phone had been thrown into a sink sometime on the morning of October 27th, the same morning Derek had left for his shift, and the damage from the water had stopped the device from functioning. That timestamp, combined with the autopsy's assessment of the body's condition, told investigators that Kim had been killed on the morning of October 27th, not on October 28th when her body was discovered. She had been dead for more than 24 hours before her husband found her. While combing through the case, detectives came across a stolen vehicle report filed on October 30th, 3 days after the murder. The car, a small SUV, had been taken from a house party in the early morning hours of October 27th. The name on that report was Lance Kirkpatrick. Lance Kirkpatrick was a man Derek knew. He was someone Derek had mentioned during questioning, a 20-something whom Derek had employed at some point, and whose connection to the household was therefore established. When detectives learned that Kirkpatrick had taken a vehicle from a party on the same night Kim was killed, and had simply never returned it, the coincidence of timing was too significant to ignore. They brought him in. Kirkpatrick was calm during the initial interview. He acknowledged knowing the Dorseys. He said he had driven to their house on October 27th, but that he had not gone inside. He maintained this position with the careful firmness of someone who has rehearsed his words and tested them against every scenario he could anticipate. The detectives listened. They asked questions. They watched his face and his hands, and the way he chose his words. And then, in a moment that detectives would later describe as the case's turning point, Kirkpatrick said something that revealed everything. He mentioned, in what might have seemed to him like an innocuous detail, that a key to the Dorsey house was kept outside the front door, under a dog statue. The room held that information for a beat. The toppled dog statue that Detective Kuzowski had noticed on his very first approach to the house, the small detail that had seemed out of place, now landed with the full weight of its meaning. Kirkpatrick knew about the hidden key because he had used it. He knew about it because he had reached beneath that statue, let himself in through the front door, and entered a home where a woman was alone, believing she was safe. I think he knew where the key was because he had lived there, one investigator said. So he got that key and he went in. A search warrant was obtained and forensic evidence recovered from the scene was compared to samples taken from Kirkpatrick. DNA evidence tied him directly to the crime scene. His biological material was found in connection with Kim's body, on the pool cue, and elsewhere at the scene. The evidence was not circumstantial. It was physical, direct, and unambiguous. Lance Kirkpatrick was arrested. He was charged with murder in the first degree, sexual battery, and burglary. When the formal charges were read out, the prosecution's theory of the case began to take shape publicly. Investigators had determined that Kirkpatrick's motive for entering the Dorsey home was connected to a drug debt. He had, prosecutors alleged, broken into the home while Derek was away on his shift, intending to take money or property to settle financial obligations he could not otherwise meet. He had known the house. He had known the schedule. He had known the key was under the statue. But what happened inside those walls had become something far worse than a burglary. Kim Dorsey, alone in her home, had encountered the intruder. What followed was the crime scene that detectives had described as one of the most horrific they had ever processed. The pool cue broken across her body. The restraints. The 5 gunshots. The knife. In the lead-up to the trial, a man named Kiefer, a person to whom Kirkpatrick had spoken after the murder, came forward with testimony that would later prove decisive. Kirkpatrick had told Kiefer what he had done. He had described grabbing the pool cue and hitting Kim repeatedly, breaking it against her. He had described Kim reaching for her phone to call for help and the violent response that followed. He had described, in the blunt, terrible language of someone recounting an act without remorse, the moment he had stabbed her in the neck. Kiefer carried that knowledge with him until the law came knocking, and then he told the truth. The trial of Lance Kirkpatrick took place in April 2015, more than 2 years after Kim's death. 2 years during which Derek Dorsey had lived inside the knowledge of what had been done to his wife, inside the strange and complicated grief of a widower who was also a man who had been unfaithful, inside the space between his private failures and the enormous, irreversible crime that had been committed against Kim. 2 years during which Kim's family had waited for a courtroom to finally hold accountable the person who had taken her. Kirkpatrick's defense was built on a structure that required the jury to accept a version of events that contradicted the physical evidence at nearly every turn. He claimed that he had entered the house not to steal or harm, but to retrieve a piece of clothing, a sports jersey, that belonged to him. He claimed that he and Kim had engaged in consensual intimacy in the bedroom. He claimed that afterward, Kim's demeanor had changed, that something had shifted in the room, and that it was Kim who had become the aggressor. He said he had acted only to protect himself. He said he had not meant to kill her. The prosecution answered this claim with the physical evidence that the bedroom had recorded with cruel precision. A woman who had consented to an intimate encounter does not end up bound at the wrists with zip ties. A woman who is attacking an intruder does not receive a fatal stab wound to the neck as an act of defense. And a woman who had spent years building her body into a disciplined, powerful instrument of sport and fitness had, in her final conscious moments, retrieved a gun from a bedside drawer and fired it 5 times, not at a lover, but at someone she was trying desperately to kill before he killed her. The prosecution also returned to the drug debt theory, presenting the jury with evidence of Kirkpatrick's financial circumstances and his associations at the time of the murder. They presented the DNA evidence, the eyewitness account from Kiefer, and the accumulated forensic picture of what had happened in that bedroom. They asked the jury to see the timeline, the hidden key, the known schedule, the stolen car used for transportation, the attack carried out in the hours immediately after Derek left for his shift. This was not, prosecutors said, an accident or an escalated argument. This was a plan executed against a woman who had no warning and no protection. The prosecution sought the death penalty, under Florida law at the time, that required a finding of specific circumstances of aggravation, and the jury, in its deliberations, found that the standard for the death penalty had not been met. But they had no difficulty with the central question before them. Lance Kirkpatrick was found guilty of murder in the first degree. He was also found guilty of rape and burglary. On May 14, 2015, a Duval County judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence effectively composed of 3 separate life terms, one for each conviction, running together without end. Derek Dorsey, who had stood at the center of a storm not entirely of his own making, who had known things about his marriage that he kept private and had been forced to disclose in the most public and painful of circumstances, later spoke about what he had found that October morning in terms that have stayed with everyone who heard them. He said he had tried to give Kim CPR. He said he had covered her with a blanket because she was his wife and because she deserved that much dignity, that small and irreversible act of love. He said that when he finally understood she was gone, the whole shape of his world had changed. The case of Kim Dorsey did not ultimately turn on infidelity or complicated marriages or the private lives of people who are only fully known to themselves. It turned on a simpler, darker truth. A young man had entered a home through a key kept under a statue, had found a woman alone who had done nothing to deserve what was about to happen to her, and had committed an act of violence so extreme and so prolonged that the bedroom walls themselves bore witness to her refusal to stop fighting. 5 bullet holes, each one a word in the only language available to a woman who was bound and bleeding and terrified and still, somehow, determined. She had not been passive. She had not accepted what was happening. She had fought with every last measure of strength she possessed, and the room remembered it, and the detectives who arrived the next morning saw it, and the jury that convicted her killer understood it. Kim Dorsey was 38 years old. She was a trainer, a wife, a woman of energy and discipline and fire. She is remembered not as a victim who was found, but as a fighter who refused to stop until she could not fight anymore, and whose final, defiant act left 5 marks in the walls of a room where justice, in the years that followed, eventually found its way. Story 5. There are silences in a home that carry weight. Not the gentle silence of sleeping children, not the comfortable quiet of a household at rest, but the silence that accumulates when no one is watching, when no one is listening, and when 2 small people who cannot speak for themselves have been left alone in a room with a door that will not open from the inside. On the afternoon of December 10th, 2019, in a mobile home on Dome Level Road in Tallahassee, Florida, that silence lasted long enough to take a life. The life it took was 1-year-old. Brittany Delgado was 26 years old in December 2019. She had come to Florida from Virginia with the particular hope that relocation sometimes carries, the belief that a new geography can provide what a changed circumstance alone cannot. She had left behind in Virginia a history that had already extracted its toll. 3 children, removed from her custody by the state, lost through a formal process that the courts reserve for circumstances so serious that they cannot be otherwise resolved. 3 children taken. Whatever the specific circumstances that produced those outcomes, the legal system in Virginia had determined, through its own processes, that Brittany Delgado's children were safer somewhere else than they were with her. And yet, in the way that systems sometimes fail to communicate across state lines, when Brittany arrived in Florida and began her life again, she came with 2 more children. 2 boys. One was 3 years old and would come to be called Julio in the accounts that surrounded the case. The other was a baby 1-year-old named Alex. These 2 small children, who had no choice about where they lived or who lived with them, were the center of Brittany's new beginning in Florida, and they were present in the mobile home on Dome Level Road in ways that concerned people who encountered them. The house itself told a story. It was a mobile home on the outskirts of Tallahassee, functional in its structure and utterly inadequate in its condition. The interior described it as filthy, littered with trash, disordered in the way that speaks not of overwhelming circumstance but of prolonged neglect. In that conditions in which Alex and Julio had been living. Into this setting had come Pedro Agustin Ramirez Alvarado. He was 37 years old, originally from El Salvador, a man who had formed a relationship with Brittany and had moved into the mobile home with her. He and Brittany called each other husband and wife. He had asked her to marry him. She wore the engagement ring as evidence of the promise. Whatever the legal formalities, which had not been completed because Brittany was technically still married to someone else at the time, the two of them functioned as a household, as a couple, and as the two adults responsible for the care of Alex and Julio. Pedro was not the boys' biological father, but he was one of only two adults who stood between them and whatever harm the world, or the home itself, might bring. Florida's child protection system had already begun to look at that home before December 2019. Investigators had been to the address on November 3rd, just over a month before the events of December 10th, responding to a report that a child of 4 or 5 years old had been found walking unsupervised along the road in front of the house, without shoes. While that child had been wandering outside alone, Brittany Delgado had been found inside the house, asleep. The Florida Child Protection System was, at the time of the events that followed, already evaluating the situation and preparing to offer help. A family member who visited the property periodically to collect mail had, over time, accumulated a set of observations that she had not been able to set aside. She had found the children outside, unsupervised. She had seen them unclean. She had seen evidence on multiple occasions that they had not eaten for an extended period of time. That family member, on the afternoon of December 10th, would be standing on the scene when deputies arrived, and what she said in that moment, before the investigators had even begun to process the full weight of what they were dealing with, was a sentence that stayed with everyone who heard it. I knew this was going to happen. On the morning of December 10th, 2019, the day inside the mobile home on Dome Level Road began as it did on most other days. Brittany and Pedro were adults going about whatever occupied their time, and Alex and Julio were present, dependent, unable to advocate for themselves. What specifically transpired in the hours before approximately 1 in the afternoon is a matter that emerged through the investigations, interrogations, and eventually the trials that followed. What is known from the accounts of both defendants and from the forensic reconstruction of the day is that at some point, the two boys were placed in a room in the mobile home and the door to that room was closed. A space heater had been placed in that room. It was not a small, low-output device. It was a heater set to its highest setting in a room that was already warm in the Florida December, in an enclosed space with the door shut. The heater was still set to that highest setting. It was the only heater in the room. And the two boys, 1-year-old and 3 years old, were locked inside with it. Brittany had been on the phone with an insurance company, an important and lengthy administrative call. Pedro had been elsewhere in or around the house. For a period of time was not minutes but hours, the door to that room remained closed. The boys were left in that sealed, overheated space without water, without access to the rest of the home, without any adult checking on them. At approximately 1:15 in the afternoon, Brittany Delgado called 911. She reported that she had found her children unresponsive inside the home. She told the dispatcher that she needed help. Deputies from the Leon County Sheriff's Office arrived at the 6,000 block of Dome Level Road and were met with a scene that tested the composure of experienced law enforcement officers. Both children were found inside the room. Both were unconscious. Both were not breathing. Both were, in the words of the official report, very warm to the touch, a phrase that carries within it an image that requires no elaboration. Deputies immediately began life-saving measures and continued them until Tallahassee Fire Department personnel and Leon County EMS arrived and assumed care of the children. Both boys were transported to a local hospital as emergency cases. When they arrived, the medical staff recorded their internal body temperatures. 1-year-old Alex and 3-year-old Julio both registered internal temperatures of over 107 degrees Fahrenheit. The human body begins to sustain serious, irreversible damage when its core temperature reaches 104 degrees. At 107, organs fail. At temperatures above that threshold, the damage to the brain and the body accumulates with a speed that outpaces the capacity of medical intervention. The medical term applied to their condition was heat stroke-like symptoms, but no clinical language adequately describes what it means to be a 1-year-old boy, locked in a hot room, unable to call for help, unable to open the door, unable to understand why no one was coming. Shortly after arriving at the hospital, baby Alex was pronounced dead. Julio, the 3-year-old, was placed on life support in critical condition, fighting for a life that had been brought to the very edge of ending in that small, sealed room. Brittany Delgado and Pedro Ramirez Alvarado were separated and transported to the Leon County Sheriff's Office, where detectives from the Special Victims Unit conducted concurrent interrogations. The interrogations, which were later reviewed extensively by the public and by the prosecutors who built the case, produced a set of accounts that were, in their own way, as revealing as the physical evidence. Brittany's interview became, in the estimation of those who watched it, a master class in deflection, minimization, and the reassignment of responsibility. She described her children in terms that cast the older boy as a source of difficulty rather than as a victim. She returned repeatedly to the insurance call as her primary explanation for the lapse in supervision. She expressed emotion in the way that did not satisfy the experienced detectives watching her, in bursts that arrived at moments that seemed calibrated rather than spontaneous. The detectives who listened to her identified, early in the interview, a pattern of behavior that they had encountered before. A person who is calculating what to say in real time, rather than one who is processing genuine shock. Pedro's interrogation took place at the same time, in a separate room, and produced its own set of discrepancies. He was described by observers as stone-faced, controlled, offering answers that were careful rather than forthcoming. When the news was eventually communicated to both of them that Alex had not survived, the reactions in the separate rooms were noted by detectives and later became part of the evidentiary picture presented in court. Each of them, in the months and years that followed the interrogations, would attempt to cast greater responsibility on the other. Brittany would eventually agree to testify against Pedro. Pedro would take the stand in his own defense and testify against Brittany. The prosecutors, who would ultimately charge both of them with the same crimes, had anticipated this dynamic, and their theory of the case did not require a single guilty party. Their position was clear. There had been 2 adults in that home. There had been 2 children in that sealed, heated room, and both adults were responsible for what happened. The temperature measurement recorded by detectives, approximately 45 minutes after the children were found and after the door had been opened, placed the room's temperature in the high 80s. This was not the temperature of the room while the boys were inside it. This was the temperature after the door had been opened and the room had been ventilating for 3/4 of an hour. What the temperature had been in the sealed room while Alex and Julio were locked inside it, with the space heater running on its highest setting, in a Florida December, the investigators could not measure directly. But the children's body temperatures, 107 degrees and above, told the story with the authority of medical fact. The investigation that followed the initial arrests assembled a picture of neglect that was not the product of a single terrible afternoon, but of a pattern that stretched backward across many months. Florida child protection investigators had been involved. The barefoot child found wandering the road while Brittany slept inside was on the record. The family member who arrived at the scene and said, "I knew this was going to happen," had a history of observations that she had not known what to do with. The reports, the prior involvement, the knowledge held by people who had seen enough to be worried, but perhaps not enough to intervene with finality. All of it now sat in the files of an investigation into the death of a 1-year-old boy. Pedro Ramirez Alvarado had initially been held by Immigration and Customs Enforcement following his arrest, his undocumented status having been identified during the investigation. On December 12, 2019, he was transferred from ICE custody to the Leon County Detention Facility, where he faced criminal charges alongside Brittany. Both were held without bond. The charges were specific and serious. Both Brittany Delgado and Pedro Ramirez Alvarado were charged with aggravated manslaughter of a child for the death of Alex, and with aggravated child neglect causing great bodily harm for the injuries sustained by Julio. The charges reflected the prosecution's reading of the evidence, that both adults had been present, that both had been responsible for the welfare of the children, and that the conditions in that room had not appeared without warning in a single unguarded moment, but were the culmination of a household that had been failing those two boys for a long time. The legal road that followed the arrests was long, complicated by the pandemic, by the dynamics between two defendants who had once called each other husband and wife, and who now each sought to distance themselves from the other's culpability, and by the inherent difficulty of trying two people whose fates were entangled, but who insisted on their individual innocence. Brittany Delgado ultimately entered an open plea, meaning she placed the question of her sentence in the judge's hands rather than accepting a deal or going to trial. She did not contest the facts as the prosecution presented them. She took a particular kind of responsibility while maintaining her own framing of how those facts should be understood. Pedro Ramirez Alvarado went to trial. The trial was structured with a notable procedural complexity. Brittany, who had entered her plea, was called as the prosecution's first witness, placing her on the stand to testify in the case against the man she had once called her fiancé and husband. The dynamic between them in that courtroom, two people who had shared a life and a household, and who were now the primary instruments of each other's prosecution, carried a weight that the participants and the observers in the room felt fully. Brittany's testimony was, by the prosecution's design, intended to establish the relationship between Pedro and the children, the shared responsibility of the household, and the events of December 10th. Pedro, exercising his right to defend himself on the stand, provided his own account, returning blame to Brittany and to the circumstances as he understood them. Both accounts had been shaped by years of legal proceedings, by the advice of attorneys, and by the natural human tendency to frame one's own role in a tragedy in the most favorable light available. The jury in Pedro's trial heard the physical evidence with particular attention. The space heater, set to its highest setting, unplugged only after deputies arrived. The room sealed from the outside. The body temperatures, which the medical examiner had tied directly to the conditions of the room and the duration of exposure. The testimony of first responders who had arrived to find two unconscious boys and had understood immediately what they were dealing with. The Leon County EMS responder and the Tallahassee Fire Department personnel who had tried to stabilize children whose bodies had been pushed to a biological threshold from which one could not return. The jury found Pedro Ramirez Alvarado guilty of aggravated manslaughter of a child. The verdict was not an acquittal, and it was not a full exoneration of the account he had offered the court. It was the jury's determination that he bore criminal responsibility for what had happened in that room, that his presence in that household and his role in the events of December 10th made him accountable under Florida law for the death of a 1-year-old child. In April 2025, Brittany Delgado was sentenced. The judge had heard everything: the prior history in Virginia, the removal of 3 older children, the barefoot child found wandering the road while she slept, the family members' words on the afternoon of December 10th, the interrogation, the testimony, the conditions documented in photographs that investigators had taken of the mobile home. The sentence was 30 years in state prison. Julio, the 3-year-old who had survived, had been taken from the scene on December 10th and placed in medical care. His survival had not been certain in the days immediately following. He had been on life support, his body fighting the damage that the room had done to him, his organs working to reclaim function that the heat had compromised. The fact that he survived is, in the context of everything else about the case, the one thread of something that is not entirely without relief. The case of Brittany Delgado and Pedro Alvarado is, at its core, a case about the intersection of neglect and time. Not the sudden violence of a weapon or a confrontation, but the slower, more terrible violence of a door closed on children who could not open it, of a heater set to its highest setting, of hours that passed while 2 adults were otherwise occupied. It is a case that asks uncomfortable questions about the systems designed to protect children, about the visits that had been made to that address, about the family member who had seen enough to worry, and the structures that had not yet intervened with the force required. Baby Alex was 1 year old. He had been alive long enough to walk, perhaps, or to begin to, long enough to have a name and a face, and the particular quality of presence that 1-year-old children carry in a room. He had not been alive long enough to understand danger, to call for help, to know that the rising heat in the room he was locked inside was something he needed to be protected from. He needed the adults who were responsible for him to make that determination. They did not. The room on Dome Level Road has long since been vacated. The mobile home on that stretch of Tallahassee Road stands, or does not stand, without any particular significance to the people who pass it on their daily routines. But in the records of the Leon County Sheriff's Office, in the files of the Florida courts, in the sentences now being served by both defendants, the afternoon of December 10th, 2019, is permanently present. 2 deputies arrived at 1:15 in the afternoon and found 2 children who felt very warm to the touch. They began life-saving measures immediately. For one of them, they were too late. Story 6. There is a particular kind of grief that settles over a small town when one of its own disappears without explanation. It is not the sharp, defined grief of a funeral, which at least has the mercy of an ending. It is an open, restless grief, a wound that cannot close because there is no certainty to close it. The town of Buna, Texas, a small community tucked into the deeply wooded, pine-rich landscape of Jasper County in southeast Texas, lived inside that grief for more than 3 years. Christy Russo was one of theirs. She had grown up there, raised her children there, built her life in those pine-shadowed roads and quiet neighborhoods. When she vanished on October 21st, 2021, the town held its breath and waited. It would wait for a very long time. Jasper County sits in a corner of Texas that most of the state barely thinks about. It is rural in the way that is not picturesque but honest, a working landscape of pine forests and river bottom land, where the summers are long and humid and the winters mild and gray. Buna is a small community within this county, the kind of place where everyone recognizes the same surnames across generations, where the high school football team is a matter of community identity, and where a person's disappearance is not an abstraction, but a rupture in the fabric of daily life. Christy Russo was 31 years old in October 2021. She was a mother of 2, a woman who was embedded in the community around her through the ordinary, but irreplaceable threads that children, family, and shared history create. Her mother, Debbie Wilson, later spoke to news reporters about her daughter with the plain-spoken love of a woman who had raised a child and watched that child become a person she was genuinely proud of. Christy was, to those who knew her, simply one of the people that a community is built from, present, warm, connected, and wholly without the kind of drama that might explain why someone would want her gone. The last confirmed movements of Christy Russo on October 21st, 2021, were tracked and documented by investigators during the years of work that followed. She had been seen in Buna during the course of that day. Her movements through the afternoon had been verified through the ordinary digital and social traces that a modern life produces without effort. Phone data, surveillance footage, the accounts of people who saw her. Everything was normal. She was a woman going about her day. And then, at some point in the late afternoon, she traveled to County Road 777 in Buna. She drove to the property of a man named Colby Hunter Tatum. After that, no one who loved her ever saw her again. Colby Tatum was 27 years old at the time of Christie's disappearance. He was a Buna man who did transmission work from his property on County Road 777, a rural address surrounded by the wooded acreage that defines so much of Jasper County's landscape. He kept a firearm, a Rossi .44 special revolver, which he said he maintained for protection given the nature of working in an isolated property. He had a young son who lived with him, and he had a girlfriend, a 29-year-old woman from Silsby named Murray Collier, who was sharing his residence with him at the time of the events that would eventually unravel in a Jasper County courtroom more than 3 years later. When Christy was reported missing, the Jasper County Sheriff's Office began the work that all missing person cases demand: the interviews, the retracing of last known movements, the examination of the people in her life and the places she had been. It did not take long for Colby Tatum's name to emerge as a person who had been connected to Christie and who had been the last known place she was headed. Investigators went to County Road 777. They interviewed Tatum. They searched the property. The investigation was, from its earliest stages, pointing in one direction, and Jasper County Sheriff Chuck Havard said, publicly and with the directness that small county law enforcement sometimes permits itself, that Tatum had been their sole suspect from the beginning. But the central, maddening reality of the case was this. Christie Russo was gone, and her body was nowhere to be found. Without a body, without physical confirmation that a crime had occurred and what that crime was, the legal path toward prosecution ran into the hard obstruction of insufficient evidence. Law enforcement could suspect. They could investigate. They could bring in other agencies, which Havard did, engaging the FBI and the Texas Rangers in searches of the property and the surrounding landscape. They could search the river. They could gather testimony and digital records and forensic traces from the property. All of it pointed at the same man. None of it, in the first 2 years, was enough to build a criminal case that would satisfy a grand jury. For the Russo family, and for Debbie Wilson in particular, those 2 years were not a legal abstraction. They were 2 years of waking up every morning into the continued reality that Christie was gone, that the family did not know where she was, that they could not bury her or hold a service that had the finality a death deserves, and that the man they believed had taken her was living freely in the same small community where they all existed together. "I think he should get life," Debbie Wilson told a reporter in November 2024, more than 3 years after her daughter's disappearance. The simplicity of that sentence, spoken with the exhaustion of someone who has been holding pain for too long, is difficult to hear without feeling the full weight of what it contains. The breakthrough that finally moved the case toward its legal conclusion did not come dramatically. It came through the accumulation of evidence gathered over 2 full years of persistent investigation, assembled methodically by Jasper County Captain Jason McClelland and the team working the case, supplemented by the FBI and the Texas Rangers, sifted and organized until the weight of it was sufficient to place before a grand jury. In December 2023, District Attorney in Pickle presented the case. The grand jury heard testimony from Captain McClelland. They examined the evidence. They returned an indictment for murder. The indictment stated that investigators believed Christie Russo had died from a gunshot wound and that Tatum had disposed of her body. Without a body, an indictment on those terms was a significant legal step. It meant that the evidence assembled, though it lacked the definitive confirmation a corpse provides, had been judged sufficient by 12 citizens to formally charge a man with taking a life. A warrant was issued for Tatum's arrest. On the evening of January 4th, 2024, more than 2 years after Christie Russo was last seen alive, Colby Hunter Tatum was located at a Walmart in Lumberton, Texas, a city to the south in Hardin County, and was taken into custody by the Lumberton Police Department. The following morning, Jasper County Chief Deputy Scott Duncan and another deputy made the drive to collect him. KFDM News cameras were rolling when they led Tatum, shackled and handcuffed, into the Jasper County Jail. He was held on a bond of $1 million. But the arrest, significant as it was, did not end the uncertainty that had defined the case for 2 years. Tatum was charged. He was jailed. The legal machinery of a murder prosecution was now in motion. Pretrial motions were filed, hearings were held, and the case moved through the slow procedural corridors that the law requires. Through all of it, Christie Russo remained missing. Her family still could not answer the question that no amount of legal process can satisfy on its own. Where was she? While the murder case worked its way through the system, a parallel story was developing that would, in March 2025, crack the case open in a way that nothing before it had managed to do. Investigators examining the full circumstances of Tatum's life at the time of the killing turned their attention to the Rossi .44 Special, the firearm that Tatum had kept at his property and that investigators believed had been used to shoot Christie. A weapon used in a killing is evidence of the highest order. It can tie a perpetrator to an act with a specificity that other categories of evidence rarely match. The gun was not with Tatum when he was arrested. It had not been recovered during the searches of his property. Investigators traced it. What they found was that on December 30th, 2021, 10 weeks after Christie's disappearance and 2 months after the killing, the firearm had been brought to the Big Thicket pawn shop in Silsbee and sold. The person who had walked into that pawn shop with Colby Tatum's Rossi .44 special and exchanged it for cash was Murray Collier, his girlfriend, who had been living at his residence on the night Christy Russo was killed. Sheriff Chuck Havard, when he publicly announced Collier's arrest in April 2025, used language that was neither diplomatic nor measured. He was direct in a way that only a law enforcement official operating within a small community, who has watched a family suffer for 3.5 years, can be. She literally destroyed this investigation by covering for Colby Tatum, Havard said, stating that had Collier not disposed of the weapon, the investigation would have concluded significantly sooner with an extremely different outcome. Murray Collier, 29 years old, was arrested and charged with tampering with physical evidence, a third-degree felony under Texas law carrying a maximum sentence of 10 years in state prison. She had known. She had been present in that house. She had taken the weapon that had killed a woman, driven it to a pawn shop, and sold it for cash. For 3.5 years, she had lived with that knowledge while Christy Russo's family lived without answers. In the weeks leading up to March 2025, the murder case against Colby Tatum was scheduled to proceed to trial. What happened instead was a development that families of victims sometimes welcome and sometimes grieve over in complicated ways. Tatum agreed to plead guilty, but not to murder. Through negotiations between his attorney and the district attorney's office, a plea was reached in which Tatum would plead guilty to tampering with a human corpse, the second-degree felony charge arising from his disposal of Christie's body, rather than to the murder charge itself. The plea deal was an outcome shaped by the legal reality of the case. After 3.5 years of searching, the physical remains of Christy Russo had never been fully recovered. Building a first-degree murder conviction at trial against a defendant whose body disposal had been so thorough that the physical evidence had been largely destroyed carried risk. The district attorney and the sheriff consulted the Russo family about the decision. The family had to weigh what they wanted: the longest possible sentence for a murder conviction that might fail, or a guaranteed guilty plea, and the certainty of the maximum sentence under the charge Tatum was prepared to accept. They chose the certainty. On the morning of Tuesday, April 1st, 2025, Colby Hunter Tatum stood in the Jasper County Courthouse and entered his guilty plea. He was 30 years old. He told the court what had happened on October 21st, 2021, for the first time in a public, sworn legal proceeding. He testified that on that evening, he was at home on County Road 777 with his young son. He said he saw someone near his son's bedroom, and, in a state of paranoia brought on by drug use, he grabbed his firearm and fired. He said he did not know it was Christy Russo until he walked up to the body after the shots were fired. He said he panicked. He said he freaked out. He said he took her body outside and burned it in a burn barrel on his property that same night. He said he used bleach to clean the scene inside the house. When the fire had done its work, he collected the remains and drove to the Neches River, to the area beneath the bridge near Ivadale, and disposed of them there. The judge sentenced Colby Tatum to 20 years in prison, the maximum allowed under the second-degree felony charge to which he had pled guilty. But the day was not over. Immediately following the sentencing, while the family and the reporters and the investigators were still processing what had just happened in the courtroom, Sheriff Havard did something that spoke to the commitment he had made to this case and to this family across more than 3 years of work. He personally loaded Tatum into his SUV and drove him back to County Road 777. The property on County Road 777 looked as it had always looked from the road. Rural address with the flat, open quality of southeast Texas working land, surrounded by the pine stands that define the landscape. Inside the fence line, however, The property held information that no one outside of Colby Tatum had fully known until that afternoon. Sheriff Havard and his investigators, guided by Tatum's own account, went to the burn area. They searched with the painstaking precision that forensic evidence demands. And they found things. KFDM's camera, which had been present for Tatum's arrest, his arrival at the jail, and his guilty plea, was rolling again as investigators moved through the property. They recovered several items that Havard described as possibly being human remains. They found bone fragments, and in the targeted search area, they discovered an article of clothing. When members of Christie's family were shown that clothing, they identified it as belonging to her. The Port Arthur Fire Department dive team was subsequently deployed to the Neches River to search the water near the Iverdale Bridge. The same river that had quietly received what was left of Christy Russo more than 3 years earlier was now being searched by divers, looking for what might remain beneath the surface. For Debbie Wilson, who had spent 3.5 years waiting, the day that produced a guilty plea, a sentence, and the recovery of her daughter's clothing from a burn pile on a rural property in Buena was not a day of triumph. It was something more complicated than that. A guilty plea for tampering rather than for murder is not the life sentence she had said she wanted. 20 years, with the possibility of parole under the Texas system, is not the same as a conviction for ending a life. The man who had admitted, in open court, to shooting her daughter, burning her body, and scattering her remains in a river, would potentially walk out of prison while Debbie Wilson was still alive to watch it happen. What the case of Christy Russo leaves behind is a portrait of how the absence of a body can stretch justice across years, can reduce a family to the particular purgatory of having no grave to visit, no service that fully acknowledges what happened, no physical place in the landscape where grief can land and rest. It is also, however, a testament to the refusal of a sheriff and his team to let the case become cold, to the persistence of a district attorney who took an imperfect case to a grand jury and obtained an indictment, and to the decision of a family to accept an imperfect resolution over the continuing uncertainty of a trial that could not guarantee a better outcome. Christy Russo was 31 years old. She was a mother of 2 children who grew up without her. She was the daughter of a woman who spent 3.5 years living in the open wound of not knowing, and who then had to sit in a courtroom and listen to the man who killed her daughter describe the act in terms that the law had agreed to call tampering. She was a person from Buena, Texas, from the pine forests and the river bottom land of Jasper County, and she is remembered there with the depth of feeling that small communities reserve for those they have lost in ways they cannot fully make sense of. The Neches River runs on beneath the bridge at Iverdale, as rivers do, indifferent to what has been deposited in their currents and what has been carried away. The divers searched. The investigators documented. The sentence was pronounced. The clothing that had once belonged to a living woman was recovered from a burned pile on a rural property and identified by the people who had loved her. It was not everything. It was not enough. But in the patient, imperfect, deeply human work of a justice system doing what it could with what it had, it was what the case of Christy Russo could deliver. Story 7. The summer night in Korzer stretched out lazily, the kind of quiet evening that wrapped around the small Danish town like a familiar blanket. It was July 10th, 2016, and the air carried the faint scent of blooming linden trees mixed with the distant hum of the sea from the Great Belt. Korzer, a coastal community on Zealand with its tidy streets and close-knit families, felt like the safest place in the world to grow up. For 17-year-old Emily Anine Skovgard Meng, this was home, a place where she could dream big without fear, where the worries of the wider world seemed far away. Emily was the girl everyone noticed not for being loud, but for her quiet radiance. Born on July 31st, 1998, she had a voice that could fill a room, a talent for singing that made her stand out in the local church choir. Her friends described her as kind-hearted, the type who remembered birthdays and offered a listening ear during tough times. With her long dark hair often tied back in a simple ponytail and a smile that lit up even the grayest Danish days, Emily embodied the innocence of youth in a town where doors were left unlocked and neighbors waved from their porches. That night, Emily had been out with a group of friends, celebrating the freedoms of summer in the nearby city of Slagelse. It was a typical outing for teenagers in the area: dancing, laughter, and the thrill of staying out late under the never-quite-dark Scandinavian sky. The group had taken the train back to Korzer, arriving at the station around 4 a.m. The platform was empty save for the echo of their footsteps and the soft rumble of the receding train. Emily, dressed in jeans and a light jacket against the cool morning breeze, waved goodbye to her companions. She lived just a short walk from the station, along a path she had taken countless times before. It was only about a kilometer, through familiar streets lined with modest houses and the occasional street lamp casting pools of yellow light. No one thought twice about her heading home alone. Korzer was that kind of place, where trust was as natural as breathing. As the sun began to peek over the horizon, painting the sky in soft pinks and oranges, Emily's mother, waiting at home, started to worry. Emily had plans that morning: a performance at the local church at 9:30 a.m., where her voice was set to lead the congregation in song. She had practiced for weeks, her notes filling the house with melody. But 9:30 came and went without a sign of her. Calls to her phone went unanswered, texts unread. By midday, the family had alerted the police, their initial concern turning to a gnawing dread. South Zealand police launched a search immediately, treating the disappearance as serious from the start. Volunteers poured in, neighbors, classmates, even strangers from surrounding towns. They combed the paths from the station, checked the beaches along the fjord, and scoured the woods nearby. Divers were called in to search the waters of the Great Belt, fearing the worst. Posters with Emily's photo, her bright eyes and warm smile, went up everywhere, and the media picked up the story quickly. Missing teenager from Korzer, the headlines read, capturing the nation's attention in a country where such events were heartbreakingly rare. Days turned into weeks, and the search intensified. Police interviewed Emily's friends, piecing together the night's events. She had seemed happy, carefree, posting a photo on Instagram earlier in the evening with her group, captions full of emojis and inside jokes. No arguments, no signs of trouble. The route home was reviewed frame by frame from any available CCTV, but the small-town infrastructure offered little. A white car had been spotted near the station around that time. A Hyundai i30, common enough not to raise alarms then, but it lingered in the investigators' minds. Tips flooded in, sightings of a girl matching her description in nearby cities, rumors of runaways or accidents. Emily's family held vigils, her mother speaking publicly about her daughter's love for music and her dreams of becoming a singer. The emotional toll was evident in every press conference, the parents' faces etched with exhaustion and hope. Korzer, once a bubble of safety, now felt shadowed, its residents locking doors for the first time in years. As July bled into August, the optimism faded. The police expanded the search radius, using dogs trained to detect human scent and helicopters to scan remote areas. Emily's backpack, the one she carried that night, was never found, nor her phone. Her bank account remained untouched, ruling out any voluntary disappearance. Psychics called in tips, as they often do in such cases, but nothing panned out. Whispers began about the possibility of foul play. Had a stranger passed through the quiet town? Or was it someone known? The police followed every lead, but the trail seemed to vanish into the morning mist. Months passed, and the case grew cold. By October 2016, the intense daily searches slowed, though the investigation never stopped. Emily's family refused to give up. The media coverage shifted from urgent pleas to reflective pieces on youth safety in Denmark. Police reviewed old cases, wondering if this disappearance linked to unsolved crimes in the region. Korzer healed slowly, but the void left by Emily was palpable, a reminder that even in idyllic places, darkness could lurk. Then on December 13, 2016, a hunter walking near Karensminde Beach, about 60 kilometers from Korzer, made a gruesome discovery. In a shallow plastic bag submerged in the waters of Karensminde North, a small lake connected to the sea, he found human remains. The body was badly decomposed, wrapped in tape and plastic, but dental records confirmed the worst. It was Emily. The news hit Denmark like a thunderclap. Autopsy revealed she had been strangled, the tape around her neck the likely cause of death. She had been dead since shortly after her disappearance, her body hidden away for months. The emotional outpouring was immense. Friends collapsed in tears, the family issued a statement of profound sorrow, and the Prime Minister offered condolences. Korzer held a memorial service at the church where Emily was to sing that morning, her empty spot in the choir a silent testament to the loss. The discovery reignited the investigation with ferocious intensity. Forensic teams worked tirelessly on the remains, searching for DNA, fibers, anything that could point to her killer. The plastic bag and tape were analyzed, common items, but the way they were used suggested deliberation. No sexual assault was confirmed due to decomposition, but the strangulation indicated a personal, violent encounter. Police revisited the white Hyundai i30 sighting, canvassing owners in the area. Dozens were interviewed, including a local man in his late 20s named Philip Patrick West, who owned such a car at the time. He lived in Korzer, worked a steady job, and seemed unremarkable, quiet, helpful to neighbors, a football enthusiast who kept to himself. A DNA swab was taken, but it yielded no match to any evidence from the scene. West faded from the radar, the lead going cold again. Years dragged on. Emily's family coped as best they could, channeling grief into advocacy for missing persons. Her mother spoke at conferences, pushing for better tracking technology in small towns. The case became a symbol of unresolved pain. Investigators never stopped. Cold case units reviewed files annually, hoping new forensics might crack it. Korzer added memorials, a bench by the station with a plaque bearing Emily's name, and life moved forward, but the question lingered: who took her? Fast forward to April 2023, nearly 7 years later. In the quiet village of Kirkerup, not far from Korzer, a 13-year-old girl vanished while walking home from school. She was last seen near a local road, her backpack left behind. Panic spread quickly. This was a similar rural area, and the echo of Emily's case was impossible to ignore. Police mobilized, and within hours they traced a suspicious vehicle, a car that led them to a residence in Svenstrup near Korzer. There, they found the girl alive but bound with plastic ties, traumatized from hours of captivity and assault. The man inside was Philip Patrick West, now 32, the same quiet Korzer resident who had been swabbed years earlier. The rescue was swift. The girl rushed to safety. West was arrested immediately, charged with abduction, rape, and attempted murder. As detectives searched his home, the connections began to surface like ghosts from the past. His white Hyundai i30 from 2016 had been sold, but police tracked it to Slovakia, seizing it for forensics. Credit card records showed purchases of duct tape and plastic bags around July 2016, items matching those used on Emily. On his computer, hidden folders revealed disturbing material, images and videos of assaults, child pornography, and crucially, evidence linking to unsolved crimes. Advanced DNA techniques, refined since 2016, detected traces of West's genetic material on Emily's clothing, found in the plastic bag with her body. A roll of tape in his home matched the chemical composition of the one around her neck, isotopic analysis confirming they came from the same batch. The pieces fell into place with chilling precision. West had lived a double life, outwardly unassuming, inwardly harboring dark impulses. Friends later described him as friendly but reserved, someone who helped with odd jobs and attended local parties without drawing attention. But the evidence painted a predator who targeted young girls in isolated spots. On April 26, 2023, South Zealand police charged him with Emily's murder, abduction, and rape, alongside the crimes against the 13-year-old and an attempted abduction of a 15-year-old in Sorrow in 2022. The family was informed privately, their relief tempered by renewed pain. "We've waited so long for answers," Emily's mother said in a brief statement, her voice steady but eyes red. The town of Corser, still scarred, watched as justice seemed finally within reach. Westa's trial began on May 14, 2024, at Nest Courthouse, a modern building in the rolling countryside of Zealand. The proceedings were closed to the public due to the sensitive nature, but journalists pieced together details from court summaries and family statements. West, now 33, appeared calm, his face expressionless as he entered the dock. Dressed in a simple shirt and slacks, he looked every bit the ordinary man he had been described as. He pleaded guilty to the abduction and assaults on the 13-year-old, admitting to binding her with plastic strips, subjecting her to violence, and possessing illegal material. But for Emily's murder, he maintained innocence, his voice flat as he denied any involvement. "I didn't do it," he said simply, though the evidence mounted against him. The prosecution, led by experienced attorneys from the Danish state, built their case methodically. They presented the DNA evidence first, the tiny traces on Emily's genes, transferred via an advanced polymerase chain reaction technique that amplified microscopic samples. Experts testified that the odds of a false match were astronomical, 1 in trillions. The tape was next. Forensic chemists explained how rare earth elements in the adhesive linked the roll from Westa's home to the murder weapon. Surveillance footage from 2016, grainy but telling, showed a white Hyundai i30 idling near the station, its license plate partially obscured but consistent with Westa's car. Credit card receipts placed him buying supplies at a local store hours before Emily's disappearance. The attempted abduction in Sorrow was tied in. West had approached a 15-year-old girl outside her school, grabbing her arm before she fought free. Witnesses and his own phone data corroborated his presence. But the most haunting evidence came from the digital trail. On Westa's computer, recovered files showed searches for missing persons cases, including Emily's, interspersed with violent fantasies. No direct confession, but the pattern was damning. A man who stalked, abducted, and escalated. The prosecutor argued West had planned to hold Emily longer, perhaps like the 13-year-old, but killed her when she resisted. The defense countered weakly, suggesting contamination in the DNA and coincidence in the car model. Westa's lawyer portrayed him as a loner with mental health issues, but no alibi held up. Throughout, West sat silently, his eyes fixed on the floor, the weight of 2 shattered families bearing down. The trial lasted weeks, with testimonies from the surviving victim, a brave 13-year-old who described her ordeal in hushed tones, her words carrying the raw terror of captivity. Emily's family attended sporadically, their presence a quiet force. Her mother took the stand briefly, recounting the endless nights of waiting, the way Emily's empty room still echoed with her songs. "She was our light," she said, voice breaking. "We need to know why." Experts on victimology explain the emotional scars, how such crimes ripple through communities. Corser's mayor spoke on the town's healing, the memorials that dotted the landscape. On June 28, 2024, the jury, unanimous in their decision, delivered the verdict. Philip Patrick West was found guilty on all major counts. The murder of Emily Meng, attempted rape and abduction of her, the full spectrum of crimes against the 13-year-old, including attempted murder, the Sorrow attempt, and possession of illegal materials. He was also convicted of violating Emily's grave by dumping her body. The judge, in a solemn reading, described the acts as heinous and premeditated, emphasizing the breach of trust in a safe community. West showed no reaction, his face a mask as the gavel fell. Sentencing followed immediately. Life imprisonment, the harshest penalty in Denmark, meaning at least 12 years before parole consideration, likely more given the severity. Additional terms included psychiatric evaluation and restrictions on contact with minors. As he was led away, the courtroom felt heavy with finality. Emily's family embraced outside, tears mixing with sighs of closure. "Justice for Emily," her father said to reporters, his arm around his wife. "She can rest now." In the aftermath, Denmark reflected on the case's lessons. Advanced forensics had cracked what years of traditional policing could not, highlighting the need for better resources in cold cases. Corser added to its memorials a plaque at Karen's Mind nor reading, in memory of Emily Meng, whose voice lives on. The surviving victim received support, her courage inspiring others to speak out. Westa's double life became a cautionary tale, how evil can hide in plain sight. For Emily's family, the wound would never fully heal, but answers brought a measure of peace. The summer nights in Corser returned to their quiet rhythm, but with a deeper vigilance, honoring the girl whose story ended too soon. The Emily Meng's case is one of profound tragedy, a reminder of vulnerability in the everyday. From that fateful walk home to the courtroom's echo, it underscores the human cost of unchecked darkness and the resilience required to seek truth. In the end, while justice was served, the loss of Emily's bright future lingers as a somber chapter in Denmark's history.